NieR Automata is going to pop up on a lot of the 2017 Game of the Year lists for the major gaming publications. It's highly regarded and has sold surprisingly well, and yet there's also a good chance many of you haven't played it. NieR Automata isn't the prettiest looking game out there, and its fans, of which there are now many, can be a little intense at times. I've no doubt already offended some of them by pronouncing the name of the game as NieR Automata instead of NieR Automata or some third or even fourth pronunciation I'm not aware of. I'm a bit old school still, so I like to read reviews before buying a game. However, I didn't find the reviews for NieR Automata all that helpful. Most of them boiled down to describing how powerful the experience was, which, to be fair to reviewers, is damn hard to articulate. Reviewers clearly wanted to heap praise on the story while also treating every detail about the game as a spoiler. As you probably know by now, the game has multiple endings. That's common knowledge for most people, and yet others will claim that's a spoiler in and of itself. In other words, just talking about this game can be like walking through a minefield blindfolded after a few too many shandies. This might just be me, but I find that the more people tell me to watch or play or read something, the less likely I am to follow that advice if they don't give me any good reason why. I know this isn't a logical thought process, but it's definitely something I've noticed over the years, and it's the reason it took me so long to get into shows like Westworld, for example. I've structured this video to be the review I wish I'd seen before buying the game. No doubt this video won't be to everyone's taste, but if you're still on the fence about NieR Automata, then this video may help. That said, I do still fall into the trap of many other reviewers by coming out in favour of the game without being precise about why just because of spoilers. I'm nothing if not a hypocrite. As always, I like to tell people the score I've awarded the game up front. I rate games on a 5-star system with no half stars because if you're doing that then you really should just be using a 10-point scale. Sorry, that's just a little pet peeve of mine. I generally find it fairly easy to rate games on this system, but I can honestly say that I've never found a game so hard to score as NieR Automata. I had issues with this game that were so significant I could have given it a 2 out of 5 and not felt guilty. On the other hand, parts of the game stuck with me for days and suggested that a 5-star rating wouldn't be out of place. In the end, I decided to go with 4 out of 5. If this sounds a little underwhelming, then I really would encourage you to watch the rest of the video to see if the game might still appeal to you, because if it does, this might end up being one of your favourite games of the year or even the generation. If you'd prefer to read a standard length review instead of slogging through this video, then there is one on my website which is linked to in the comments. I'm also on OpenCritic now as a contributor, so if you want you can add me to your list of trusted reviewers on there. I'm about to get stuck into the good stuff now, but first I'll give a quick spoiler warning of sorts. As I mentioned earlier, gamers have a wide variety of ideas as to what constitutes spoilers for this game. If you are so sensitive to spoilers that you consider, for example, knowing there are big robotic machines in Horizon Zero Dawn to be a spoiler, then this review might be a bit much for you. Also, sorry for just spoiling Horizon, my bad. If on the other hand you're a normal human being, then you should be just fine. I've already mentioned that there are numerous playthroughs in the game. I will be going into more detail on how they work, but I will not talk about specific story beats. I will mention that you play as 3 different characters in that game because that fact is made blatantly clear in much of the artwork for the game. I really don't consider it to be a secret. There is one small part of the review where I spoil a side quest and a tiny bit of content from the second half of the game because it's important to support an argument I want to make. I'll provide timestamps and a clear warning so you can easily skip that bit if you like. In summary, I really don't consider this review to contain major spoilers, but I've seen so much bitching in other review comment threads that I thought a warning was fair. Okay, let's get going. NieR Automata is one stylish looking game. It's not a graphical powerhouse by any means, but Yoko Taro presents the game with such flair and panache that it's easy to look past some of the flaws. NieR Automata is primarily a third-person hack-and-slash action RPG set in a quasi-open world. That's a bit of a mouthful, however not even all those adjectives come close to describing the true substance here. In addition to the standard third-person view with the camera behind the character, you will also control the character from a top-down and side-on perspective on the ground, and all 3 angles when they're involved in flight-based combat as well. There's a lot to look at, but the bread and butter of the game is clearly the basic third-person view in an open world, so let's start there. NieR Automata takes place on a post-apocalyptic Earth, which gives it an excuse for looking a little empty, but even so this world looks as drab as it is lifeless. Most of the game is spent in the city ruins, which all look largely the same. I'm fairly sure a lot of the assets are duplicated, it certainly feels that way. The ruins look good enough if you squint, but whenever you stop moving it's hard not to notice the flat textures which, without exaggeration, really do belong on a last generation console. There are also odd design choices all over the place, such as huge openings in buildings that invite the player to explore inside or at least try to nip through for a shortcut before hitting an invisible wall. A bit of debris or rubble on the floor to block the path would have been more convincing than an invisible wall, while still presenting a believable crumbling building. The artistic world building consists almost entirely of old buildings and natural plant life. The designers were perhaps aware that they needed a little more in there, so they scattered a few random rusty cars around just for kicks. With thousands of years in the future, I'm not convinced these cars would still be standing, and it looks a little silly. Things get even more sparse when you leave the city ruins and make it to the desert, although obviously it's more appropriate in this instance. Besides, the emptiness serves a purpose by letting you slide down the slopes like Link, except without worrying about shield breaking. I'm being a little harsh, and to be honest, it's not all that bad. Far from it. The amusement park is a section of the map so beautiful that I challenge you not to stop and look around when you first arrive. The machines dancing and throwing confetti around provides a welcome change of pace following a fairly frantic introduction. The only bad side is that it makes the rest of the game look even more drab by comparison. I do wish you didn't have to go back to the amusement park quite so often because it mitigates the impact somewhat on the 14th visit. The limited colour palette also applies to the main characters and machines. The androids you play as and the ones who accompany you are all dressed in black with white hair and a black blindfold. Obviously, in theory, it makes a lot of sense for the androids to look alike, however in practice this can get bloody chaotic during battle, especially during the 2D combat when frankly I gave up trying to tell which one I was and just bashed the buttons. This scene on a roller coaster was a noteworthy offender. I genuinely kept getting confused about which character I was in this fight. There aren't enough different machine models for my liking, and this lack of variety is further compounded by the machines all being the same colour. Thematically it does make sense, but I'd at least have liked the machines to change colour when they level up. Instead, a level 1 machine looks exactly the same as a level 60 machine of the same type, and even fights in the same way. The only difference is the numbers. The mixture of different game modes helped mitigate some of the boredom I felt from combat. The tutorial starts you off in a flying mech suit with a behind the camera view and then moves to a top down and even side scrolling view at one point. Likewise, there is some top down on foot combat in addition to the side on action. The camera moves smoothly from one to the other, and my only complaint is that the action doesn't switch things up more often. The camera isn't quite so competent in narrow corridors, mind you. Fortunately this is infrequent, but when things go wrong, they go very wrong. As is seemingly becoming a tradition in video games, the map in NieR Automata is absolutely dreadful. I might be imagining this, but it seems like developers are reluctant to provide players with navigational aids now, as if they want us to struggle to find our way around the world. The map is essentially all one colour, and I eventually stopped looking at it. I ended up just fast travelling to the point nearest the objective and trying to stumble my way to the correct place. Not all games need maps, but NieR Automata does, and the one it has is simply not up to task. I've been bashing the game's appearance, so a bit of context is required. NieR Automata doesn't need to look as good as, for example, Horizon Zero Dawn. For most of the game, NieR Automata runs at 60 frames per second, and given the frantic nature of combat, that has to take priority over filling the world with pretty little details and accessible interiors. NieR Automata doesn't quite hit the magic 60 all the time. In fact, it fails quite often, but it is at least consistent about it, with the drops generally only happening when moving from one part of the map to the other, particularly when entering the city ruins. I don't think the game ever drops below 30, but the occasional crash from 60 to about 45 can be quite jarring. I'm reluctant to ignore issues like this, however I will say that I never noticed frame drops during the all-important combat. Frame rate dips of any kind are not ideal, but it is fair to say they never affected gameplay here. I should point out that I'm playing the game on PS4. I'm sure a beastie PC can mitigate many of these problems. In my last review for the Sexy Brutale, I spent a decent chunk of time talking about how much I love the music and described it as some of the best I've heard in recent memory. I kept humming it for days after playing, until NieR Automata came along, that is. Without wanting to sound overly dramatic, NieR Automata has quite possibly the best music in any game ever. Each level has its own rousing theme, from the city ruins to the amusement park, to the forest. It's all of a phenomenally high quality, but none more so than the music that accompanies the ending, which brings the story to a rousing conclusion in a way that only great music can.
I feel like I'm losing hope. starts to overflow. My cries are inconspicuous. Tell me, God, are you punishing me? Is this the price I'm paying for my past mistakes?
I'll forever associate that music with the feelings I experienced at the end of the game, and I've already bought the game's official soundtrack. For context, I've never bought the soundtrack for a game before, it's that good. Voice acting is a little more hit and miss. The two androids at the beginning of the game, 2B and 9S, both come across as a little irritating at first, with 2B being overly cold and 9S being too friendly.
You know, ma'am, I'm glad you're here.
Why?
Scanners like me mostly work alone. Scouting out enemy lines and all that, I don't usually get a partner. It's kind of fun.
Emotions are prohibited.
Sorry, ma'am.
And another thing, stop calling me ma'am.
Huh?
It's unnecessary.
Alright then. 2B it is.
For the first hour, I found the voice acting distracting, but the characters quickly became quite endearing and the voices stopped bothering me. I ended up missing the moments when there wasn't any voice acting during conversations with vendors or certain side quests. Even the machines chip in with some haunting dialogue once in a while. I don't like to go into too much detail with sound effects because it's far from my area of expertise. It seemed decent enough though. The stereo sound is good enough to detect where enemy threats are coming from, and the metal on rusty metal sounds of the combat meant it was often more stimulating to listen to than to play. The important thing to take out of this limited discussion is that the musical score is phenomenal and almost justifies the entrance fee by itself. If nothing else, buy the soundtrack. For full disclosure, I haven't played any of the Drakengard games nor the original NieR. Before playing NieR Automata, I heard a lot of people saying you don't need to play those games to understand the story here, however I do think a little bit of context is important. Events at the end of Drakengard lead to the release of a disease called white chlorination syndrome, which spreads rapidly throughout the entire human race, effectively turning people to salt. The original NieR followed on a couple of thousand years into the future. The humans that survived, in addition to having well-flavoured food, discovered a way to separate human souls from their bodies. They also created replicants, beings who look identical to humans, with the idea being that the souls would inhabit the replicants when the disease died out. However, the replicants ended up developing personalities of their own and the human souls couldn't inhabit them. Humanity ended up going extinct. Or so we thought. In the beginning of NieR Automata, it's revealed that a small group of humans managed to survive the disease that wiped out most of the species. As if things hadn't been tough enough, aliens invaded Earth and used machines to destroy the surviving humans. Humanity was once again under threat, so the survivors fled via rockets to the moon. They're holed up on the moon waiting for the alien and machine threat to be eliminated. To that end, they went about building a group of androids known as YORHA, specifically designed to exterminate the machines and aliens on Earth to make it habitable for humanity again. That's where 2B and 9S come in. In case you're wondering, the B stands for battle and the S stands for scanner. Most of the story is fairly bland when broken down into the beats, or at least for the first half of the game. YORHA gets word of a machine base, so you go in to attack it. This is the tutorial, and it's actually one of the more exciting parts of the story. After the introduction, the story quickly becomes a case of go here, go there, and occasionally defeat a big robot that appears with little rhyme or reason. Small machines litter the world, however the larger threats come out of nowhere both physically and in terms of the story. At least that's how the first half plays out, and that brings me to the issue of the multiple endings. As I said, I'm not going to spoil any story beats or give out what I consider to be big spoilers. The reason I want to discuss the supposed multiple playthroughs is that I'm worried talk of these endings puts a lot of people off buying the game. Depending on who you listen to, you might hear that you'll either need to play through the game 3 times or even 5. I'm not generally one for multiple playthroughs or new game plus modes, so I know this sort of talk can prove off-putting. The thing is, this whole multiple playthroughs thing is largely nonsense. There are multiple endings, but it's a huge exaggeration to say you need to play through the game 5 times. Here's how it works. You first play the game as 2B and will reach what is described as ending A after anywhere from 10 to 20 hours depending on how many side quests you complete. After this, you'll be prompted to start the game again. This time you'll follow through the same story beats, but instead playing as 9S instead of 2B. Most of the story is the same, but you'll learn a few additional details to flesh out what's going on. This is the only part of the game which could be described as being a new playthrough, but it doesn't necessarily need to take you very long the second time around. If you did the side quests the first time, then you can feel free to skip them this time unless you want to level up some more, for example. On the topic of the side quests, I would encourage you to do these early because certain events happen in the story near the end that shut all the side quests off without much warning. Once you've reached the same finale as before, the game finishes with ending B, except the story clearly isn't finished. This is much more like the midpoint. In the second half of the story, you play as 3 characters and complete the game to get a third ending. To get the final 2 main endings, you simply replay the final scene and choose a different ending. This is all further complicated by the extra joke endings to bring the total up to 26. You don't need to worry about those, although some of them are fairly entertaining. To summarise, you have to play through the first half of the game twice, although it's not entirely the same, and then you repeat a small scene at the end of the game to get 3 different endings. If you found all the talk of multiple playthroughs to be off-putting, then I would encourage you not to worry about it. As you can probably tell, I'm a little on the sceptical side when it comes to the need for all these multiple endings. I get they are a tradition in Yoko Taro's work, but they seem to have become the focus of NieR Automata in a way I doubt was ever really originally intended. For example, I've read and watched quite a few think pieces on how NieR Automata shows that some stories can only be told in video game format, with the emphasis usually placed on the multiple endings. I agree that NieR Automata is a special story that is best told in a video game, but not because of the endings. In my opinion, it's much more to do with the way the player interacts with the narrative that makes it powerful. If NieR Automata only had one ending, it would still be just as memorable. Just to be clear, I didn't particularly enjoy the moment-to-moment story beats, but I did love the themes and narratives portrayed. However, NieR Automata isn't going to be for everyone, and I don't mean that to sound pretentious or that you're dumb if you don't get it. NieR Automata is going to mean different things to different people. If you're a fan of Yoko Taro's work, then you'll love all the lore that builds on the previous connected games. Even if you're not an existing fan, you might love the characters and their arcs, or you might love the anime-style delivery. For me, NieR Automata didn't connect with me until right at the end. It took me by surprise and I ended up thinking about existentialist themes for a week afterwards. That probably does sound pretentious, but it's not intended to. The story may not connect for you, and unfortunately it's hard to know until you experience it for yourself because there's no obvious points of comparison. Being unique brings its own set of disadvantages for consumers hoping to make an informed decision. You're going to have to take a risk with this one, I'm afraid.
And as time comes to a halt, silence starts to overflow.
The original NieR had a reputation for rather average combat, so fans rejoiced when it was announced that Platinum Games was dealing with the combat for NieR Automata. From what I've seen, the combat has certainly improved from the previous game, but it's nowhere near as good as I'd hoped. I wanted Bayonetta or Metal Gear Rising. I got a faster and more fluid version of Legend of Korra instead. The main character, 2B, carries 2 swords for 2 different types of attack, light and heavy. Pressing squared is a light attack and triangle is a heavy attack. You'll need to use the heavy attack to knock off the shields carried by certain machines. R1 activates the pod you can see floating around 2B. Initially the pod can only fire basic lasers, but it can upgrade to missiles and other fancy stuff. It also has a special attack on a cooldown timer which can be anything from a protective barrier to a large mallet. My biggest gripe with the combat is the lack of depth. You can chain together some light and heavy attacks to form basic combos, but the combo always ends when you use a heavy attack. For example, you can press square 3 times and then end with triangle. If you hold down square or triangle, you'll launch into a slightly different combo, but that's about it. It's all just incredibly samey. There are plenty of different weapons to pick from, but they don't feel different when you use them. There's little variety in the tactics you'll use to defeat the machines. If you have a group of small enemies to take on, then it's probably best to use a heavy attack for a wide swing. It won't take them out in one go though, so you'll need to do it again and again. It's just a matter of persevering with the boredom basically. When up against the bigger machine, then it's probably best to use an aerial light attack finished off with a heavy attack, then repeat until dead. At a base level, that really is about it. The enemies take a while to go down, which could suggest frantic encounters where you time your attacks carefully and do your best to survive. That's not how it plays out because the combat is relatively risk-free. On medium difficulty it's quite difficult to die thanks to the evade ability and unlimited stamina. You can keep hammering R2 as much as you like and just dance around the enemy until an opportunity presents itself. If you get the timing just right, you can do a perfect evade which slows down time and lets you perform a special move of sorts depending on which attack you choose next. This does add a tiny layer of depth to the combat I outlined above, but it lacks any real element of skill. The perfect evade is supposed to be triggered when you're dodging an attack, but that's often not the case. I could trigger a perfect evade when in no apparent danger. Sometimes I was at least close to being hit, but other times there didn't seem to be anything triggering it at all. I still don't know what triggers a perfect evade, so I'm going to go into speculation territory. Many of the machines have little in the way of signposting for their attacks. This kind of makes sense because they're machines. A machine can start spinning its arms with no notice because, well, it's a machine. Compare this to games like Bloodborne, where there is usually clear signposting for attacks allowing you to time a perfect dodge. This is my completely pulled out of my arse theory for how I think the perfect evade works. When you dodge, the game isn't looking to see if you were about to be hit by a visual animation already in progress. It's looking to see if you were going to be hit within a certain time period, for example 1 second. This is a good example of what I mean. There is no attack forthcoming from the tank that I can see. I'm not going to be hit by it or any of the projectiles. However, I still managed to perform a perfect evade. Perhaps the tank was about to fire a projectile which would have hit me, and therefore the game has detected I'm in danger before there's any visual indicator on the screen. It might sound like a stretch, but I've poured through footage and this sort of thing happens a lot, and there's no consistent explanation that makes sense other than this one. It's definitely not just strictly a proximity issue, because I've dodged while close to enemies many times without it triggering a perfect evade. I suppose it doesn't matter. Whatever the reason, the perfect evade is generous, and combined with unlimited stamina, it is easy to just spam the dodge button and avoid most attacks. The perfect evade is one of the many gameplay features that can be improved by messing around with your Android's chip system. Instead of a skill tree, you acquire chips as you play the game. You can install these chips as you see fit to suit your playstyle. There are a fair amount of basic chips such as enhanced short and ranged attacks, melee defense, range defense, health boosts and the like. You can also regain health for defeating enemies, enhance your speed, or stop time on the execution of a perfect evade. You can also create 4 different sets of chips and switch them around on the fly, so you might have one set for smaller enemies and one for bosses. You can also change the playstyle of your allies so they can defend you while you attack, vice versa, or you can both go on the attack. These chips are crucially important as you level up. In fact, they're probably more important than your actual level. I played most of the game being significantly underleveled compared to the enemies, but thanks to a decent chipset, I didn't have too many problems for the most part. If you do die, you'll be resurrected in a new body, and that means you have to go and reclaim your chips and any experience you gained between your last save and your death. Your body is strangely hard to spot despite there being a marker on the map, although I never failed to regain my body. If your body is in a really difficult spot, you can just reload a save and not worry about it. I don't think this system adds anything to the game other than a minor annoyance. The reason this system works in Dark Souls is that death is a common part of the game. It's part of the learning process. In NieR Automata, death is rare and not something you really learn from. More often than not, the death doesn't feel like it's your fault at all. One of my pet peeves is the way enemies can easily trap you in stun locks with no way out. This wouldn't bother me so much if you could do the same to machines. However, being machines, they don't stumble and can counter you even when you're in the middle of a combo. It all just adds to the feeling that the combat isn't particularly engaging. If you do get caught in a stun lock, you'll need to use some of your health packs, and that can be an exercise in itself. In the middle of a hectic battle, you need to press down on the D-pad and then press up and down to select the type of health pack you want before pressing circle to use it. Be careful you don't press up first though, because that will change your weapon set. It's all a mess. When you get really low on health, time slows down to give you a chance to use your health kits. It's almost like the game knows its system is kind of a mess and is giving you a chance to heal. After 40 hours with NieR Automata, my hands are now slightly deformed from all the awkward positions I had to adopt for basic combat techniques and for using health kits. I've been focusing mainly on combat of 2B, who you start the game with, but things get even worse when you play as 9S. 9S only has one sword, so you can only do a light attack. His combos work slightly differently and usually involve him throwing his weapon in a way that is largely useless. Instead of a heavy attack, 9S can hack enemies, which launches you into a hacking minigame to do a decent amount of damage if successful. It's actually a great hacking mechanic, but when you have to use it like a combat technique, it gets old quickly. However, the combat is often so slow and tedious that the slightly less slow and tedious hacking is actually an improvement. As you can probably tell, I didn't enjoy much of the combat in NieR Automata. In short, I found it boring to slog through most of the machines that fill the game's open world. This could have been livened up by some interesting boss fights, but they're incredibly unimaginative and repetitive. An early boss is just a giant sphere that you end up fighting 3 times throughout the game, and just for variety, a boss in the second half of the game is a collection of spheres. This wouldn't be so annoying if these spheres were fun to fight. They're not. Their attacks are badly telegraphed and can feel a touch cheap. Conversely, the human-like opponents can be defeated by just running in circles and using your pod to shoot missiles at them. I'm not exaggerating here, you really can just run in circles. You might occasionally need to evade a well-telegraphed attack, but that's about it. I don't want to talk too much about the other types of combat because they don't form a huge part of the game. They're typically quite easy sections and feel like a respite more than anything else. There's a bullet hell vibe going on for most of these sections, so even though they also suffer from limited movesets, they at least feel hectic and exciting. Some missiles can be shot down, others need to be dodged or slashed away with a swipe of the sword. The game's best bosses are actually saved for these alternative gameplay sections, so if you're anything like me, you'll welcome their appearance. As I've mentioned, the game is, for the most part, too easy, which probably makes you wonder why I didn't just turn the difficulty up to hard. I'm sure many people can handle playing on hard, but I found it way too tough. There's a huge leap from normal to hard and more one-hit kills than I'm comfortable with, especially in a game with an awkward save system. Medium difficulty ends up being too easy because you can have 99 small, medium, large and full medkits on you at any one time. That's nearly 400 medkits, more than enough to get you through most boss battles without even needing to worry about the amount of damage you're taking. That said, I do have a bit of a confession. At one point in my first playthrough I had to turn the difficulty down to easy. I'm going to talk around spoilers, but basically at one point you lose the ability to buy more health kits for an extended period of time. I'd been trying to limit the amount I carried to force myself to not rely on them. I ended up having to make it through 3 boss fights without a single health pack to use. I also hadn't unlocked any additional chip space because I was trying to stop the game from becoming too easy. These fights weren't impossible by any stretch, but after one too many cheap deaths I decided to lower the difficulty for a few minutes. Surprisingly, this was actually kind of fun. You can load up on auto chips which do all the work for you. It's far too easy and would obviously get boring quickly, but for a few minutes it's entertaining to watch your character fly around in a series of perfect evades and well-timed attacks. When it comes to combat, it feels like NieR Automata doesn't really know what it wants to be. It's definitely not a linear game with flashy combat like Bayonetta. Bayonetta has a great system for fighting that rewards you for getting big combos and generally being stylish. There's nothing like that here, so it's always tempting just to run around in circles and use your pod to do the damage. I'd have loved the combat to be more like Bayonetta, but a linear game would make the side quests a touch tricky to execute. The combat in NieR Automata is nothing like Dark Souls or Bloodborne either. That would have been great, but that's not Platinum's area of expertise. So what is NieR Automata? The light and heavy attacks resemble a more frantic version of The Witcher 3, but without the signs or inventive bosses that livened up the combat in that game. I fiddled around with the chip setups a lot to try and find a balance between risking death occasionally and being able to chew through enemies at a satisfying rate. I never did get it just right though. I'm sure the combat in NieR Automata is a big improvement from that in the original NieR. That must be the reason why the combat in this game has received so many plaudits, because by itself I just don't think it's particularly good. It only ever felt like a chore. At times it becomes incredibly frustrating thanks to some weird shit that Yoko Taro put in just to mess with players. He does that a lot. His influence is all over this game, both good and bad, so let's take a closer look at some of those weird Yoko Taro moments.
Tell me, God, are you punishing me?
NieR Automata represents my introduction to the crazy world of Yoko Taro, and I can't say it was something I entirely enjoyed. Not until the end of the game at least. Having completed ending E, I can now see why some people think he's a genius. As I mentioned at the beginning of this review, I'm still conflicted on Yoko Taro and this game as a whole, and that's not for lack of thought on the subject. Right off the bat, the design decisions in this game rubbed me the wrong way. The best example of this is the tutorial at the beginning of the game. The tutorial itself is actually pretty damn good at, tutorializing. Is that a word? It moves you through all the different types of combat and gives you plenty of chances to practice combos. It does leave out one minor little detail though, how to use medpacks. I didn't even know medpacks existed in my first attempt. I made it to the boss at the end of the tutorial and then died. The game started me right back at the beginning of the game. I was so shocked by this that I stopped playing and looked it up online because I just couldn't believe that this was deliberate. The tutorial was largely on rails and lasted about 30 minutes. It seemed ridiculous to start over from the beginning, but the always reliable internet informed me that this was in fact the case. I'd lost a big chunk of time, but fortunately I found out how to use my health packs. Things would be different the second time around, right? Unfortunately not. I got back to the boss, which consisted of 2 flailing arms that were impossible to keep in view. I'm not going to pretend that this boss was really hard, but it is the sort of boss you can easily make a mistake on, especially when you're still experimenting with things like the evade function, as I was. As you can see here, I got quickly wiped out when at nearly full health. Actually, quickly is a bit of an understatement. I went from 80% health to dead within a quarter of a second. I don't mind the odd harsh death. As a certain series of games has proved, death can be a good learning experience. What I do take issue with is having to replay 30 minutes of content for no good reason. And there really is no good reason. The lack of a save point is something that is so clearly dreadful game design that I couldn't believe it wasn't mentioned in more reviews. In fact, not many people criticised it at all, which just seemed utterly bizarre. I looked up some of the excuses given online for this lack of checkpointing. The one I saw most was people saying that death makes sense in the context of the game's save system where you need the opportunity to back up your data. That's technically true, but it doesn't stop this being a bullshit system. There's no reason why you couldn't have been given a save point right before the boss. Another excuse trotted out is that Yoko Taro is teaching you about the futility of life and being trapped in a cycle, etc, etc. And then there's just the get good people you always have to deal with. Honestly, if you ever find yourself struggling with this game, I strongly recommend staying away from the mainstream forums. You'll just be told that you're not good enough to play such a sophisticated game. I'm not exaggerating here. Once you've got past the tutorial, you can save at vending machines dotted around the world. There might still be the odd moment of frustration when you have to repeat 10 minutes of boring combat, but generally the saving becomes more straightforward when you're in the main game. Until you do the tutorial again, that is. When you take over as NieR, you have to do the tutorial mission again, and as you probably guessed, I managed to die. Twice. I'm aware of the irony in talking about my constant deaths after going on about how easy the game was, but 80% of the times I died were in the tutorial. Remember how I mentioned that I completed Ending A without any health packs? Well, that carried through into the playthrough of NieR, so I had to complete his tutorial without any health packs as well. This wasn't a huge problem, but there was one silly death during some of the flight combat. Fortunately, the game didn't kick me back to the beginning of the tutorial, just the beginning of that section. All good. I then made it past that section and got to the boss, where I died again. This time the game put me all the way back to the beginning of the tutorial, even though I progressed further than the last time I died. I'm assuming most people won't manage to die on the tutorial as often as me, but that doesn't stop this being infuriating. You can easily lose an hour or two just repeating the tutorial, especially if you try to play on hard mode. There are plenty more bad design decisions like this, and I can't help but wonder whether Yoko Taro is just trolling us. The game drags on far too long. The first half of the game has too many side quests, but at least those side quests serve a purpose and help you understand the world. The second half of the game is the biggest offender when it comes to padding. One section has you moving from floor to floor clearing out machines, which further reminds you of the dull combat. Even worse, there's a section where you have to clear out floors by hacking 3 random chests on each floor. These sections are so unbelievably bad to play and completely unnecessary that I'm convinced this is just trolling. It could be a message about the general emptiness of open worlds or something like that. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, it's incredibly boring in places. This is the part of the video where I want to show some footage that some people might consider spoilers. I'm going to discuss an early side quest and show some footage from the second half of the game. I don't believe these moments will really spoil the game for anyone, but you have been warned. If you want to avoid the spoilers, then skip to the time on screen now or use the hyperlink in the description. The second half of the game has a lot of bullshit. This next minute or two is the closest I get to a spoiler. At one point 2B gets infected with a virus and can only move normally for a few seconds at a time before stopping and crawling along at an agonisingly slow speed. You're not given much indication about where to go, and when you're hampered you're completely vulnerable to enemy attacks. I'm sure the intention here was to replicate the feelings players felt when moving through the microwave in Metal Gear Solid 4, however it just made me really frustrated in this instance. Maybe if I knew where I was going and there were no enemies then it might have had the desired effect, but constantly dying through no fault of my own is always going to be frustrating. This should have been a touching moment, but it fell really flat. There's also a big fight scene where you get your powers stripped away and the fight becomes a complete visual mess. You can try to locate the culprits, but god, it's horrible to play. Just look at the footage on screen. This will no doubt appeal to some people as a quirky thing done by the legendary Yoko Taro, but to me it's just more bullshit. Yoko Taro definitely has his devout followers, and in my experience they are very keen to defend every aspect of the game as being deliberate and deep in a way that not everyone is capable of comprehending. If you don't like something in his games, then you just don't get what he's trying to do. Even something as basic as a lack of sensible checkpointing in the tutorial is aggressively defended by Yoko Taro fans, despite it being as close to objectively bad as you could possibly get. Try to imagine for 1 minute that Naughty Dog decided Nathan Drake would only have one life to make the Uncharted games as realistic as possible. I doubt many people would support this decision. If Yoko Taro did it, I expect some people would bend over backwards to defend it. I think Yoko Taro knows this. In fact, I'm sure he does. There's a friendly machine you deal with in the first half of the game called John Paul. In the Japanese version of the game he's called Sartre. It's not a big leap to imagine that this character is basically Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher and one of the first proponents of the existentialist movement. Existentialism plays a huge role in this game, but that's not what I want to talk about here. If you talk to Jean-Paul, you'll quickly discover that he's a bit of a prat. Many of the other machines think he's a pretentious bore, however he definitely has his admirers. Some of those admirers will ask you to take messages or gifts to Jean-Paul, who quickly dismisses them as insignificant trinkets from people not worth his time. He's rude and treats these admirers like shit. You go back to the admirers and tell them the bad news, but most of them still blindly love him. That's about all there is to the mission. It's pretty boring by itself, so I'm choosing to read something into it that probably isn't there. To me, the Jean-Paul Sartre character is basically Yoko Taro. He has fans who think he can do no wrong, and he seems determined to push their blind loyalty to the limits through gameplay mechanics that seem designed only to frustrate. I've already discussed 3 of my main gripes, being the lack of saving in the tutorial, making you walk slowly while enemies attack you, and making the screen go green while you fight blind. This is trolling of the highest level. Quite how anyone could defend this crap is beyond me. So yeah, Yoko Taro is kind of Jean-Paul Sartre, or at least how he is represented in this game, because no matter how he treats people, he will always be defended passionately, including by me, ironically, because I wasn't lying when I said I was a hypocrite. I know nothing about Yoko Taro as a person, but I actively hated him at certain points during this game. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I felt he was torturing me and seeing what he could get away with. I found most of the combat, which was designed by Platinum Games, to be quite boring, but the parts where it feels like Yoko Taro was involved were agonising. The thing is, while I'm sure he's the man behind the worst bits of the game, he's also the man behind the parts that had me thinking about the game for days after completing it. When people talk about NieR Automata being a story that can only be told through a game, I think they're right, but mainly because of the ending. The way Yoko Taro brings you in as a player and makes you contribute to the effort to break the cycle of war is expertly done. It's basically genius. I genuinely cannot think of a way the game could have executed the ending better, and I'm sure I have Yoko Taro to thank for that. I guess that makes me one of his groupies. If you hear people talk about NieR Automata as a story that needs to be played rather than watched, I urge you to ignore all the talk about the multiple endings and playthroughs. That's been hugely exaggerated, and anyway, it's not something unique to games. Seeing events play out from the perspective of different characters is sometimes referred to as the Rashomon effect after Akira Kurosawa's film Rashomon, but it's all over the place these days. Hell, even sitcoms like How I Met Your Mother have done the thing where you see events play out from someone else's perspective. The real reason NieR Automata is special is much deeper than just a gimmick about multiple endings, but it's also a spoiler that I wouldn't dream of talking about here. Yoko Taro put me through hell, but somehow he managed to make up for it at the end. Just. I've given this game 4 stars out of 5, but if you've listened to all of this review then you're probably wondering why. I've spent most of the time so far shitting on the game and it probably sounds more like a 2 out of 5. I considered a score of 2, and 3, and even 5. The range of emotions experienced when playing this game were crazy. In terms of strict gameplay, I have to say this is a 3 out of 5 at best. Occasionally I like to play a basic hack and slash game while zoning out and listening to some podcasts. If that's what you want to do, then I absolutely do not recommend NieR Automata. The combat is poor and the side quests are tedious and only worth doing for world building. Even if you absorb the story, you still have to put up with a lot of boredom to make it to the ending. Unfortunately, there's no guarantee that when you do get to the ending you'll find the journey worthwhile. This is why I found NieR Automata so hard to score. This will probably sound obvious, but the final score has to represent what I thought of the game. It can't be a recommendation or a guess at how good other people will find the game. Clearly NieR Automata is a 5-star game for some people. For others it will likely be mediocre at best. I came close to falling into the mediocre camp, but the ending did enough to raise the game up to a 4-star rating. In an ideal world, I'd recommend that everyone buy and play this game on the off chance that they end up loving it. However, not everyone has the time and money to take that risk. If you're on the fence, then perhaps go and watch a few other videos by people more positive about the game than I am and see if what they're saying resonates with you. NieR Automata is going to get mentions in Game of the Year lists, possibly quite high up some of them as well. I listened to a lot of the glowing praise about this game before playing and that influenced my experience somewhat. I don't blame people for getting excited about the game. It's a bigger budget version of a cult classic. Fans of the series want to see more people pick up the game and fall in love with it like they did. Unfortunately, I think some of the praise would have been better presented alongside some of the game's major issues. I hope that with this review I've managed to present some of the legitimate criticisms that appeared during my playthrough. That way, even if you do go on to buy the game, you might have more realistic expectations for the experience than I did. I might do another video on NieR Automata in the next month or so. It would just be a shortish think piece on some of the issues the game left me pondering after completion. My only hesitation is that I'm not entirely sure what angle to approach the issue from. I'm not going to do a complete run through of the game because there's already some great videos out there that have this covered. If you want a long form discussion on the game's story and mechanics, then check out Mr. Caption's video on the game. It's 3 hours long and well worth watching. He does make a mistake when discussing the story at the end, but it doesn't invalidate the rest of the video. There's a shorter summary of the story on Valkyrie Aurora's channel if 20 minutes is more palatable. I'd also recommend keeping an eye on Clemps' channel. He has summaries of Drakengard and NieR up already, and I'm sure he's going to do the ultimate NieR Automata video at some point. Finally, Lana Rain's channel has some deep discussion on the game's themes that are far more sophisticated than anything I could come up with. All these videos are linked to in the description below. Okay, that's it from me. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, if not, hit dislike. If you like the content on the channel, I'd appreciate it if you could subscribe and maybe even hit the bell icon to get a notification when I post a new video. I do a mixture of long form critiques and reviews. The exact type of video depends on the game and how much I got out of it. The one thing my videos have in common is they're probably longer than they need to be, but I figure there are already plenty of short review videos out there if that's your thing, so this is something different. If you have any questions, then leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. My next video will probably be on What Remains of Edith Finch, although I haven't played it yet, so that's just a tentative plan right now. Okay, that's actually it now. Thanks for listening and watching to the end.
Maybe if I keep believing, my dreams will come to life. Come to life.